I have a question for you, an unusual question perhaps. Would you rather have 400 nits or 500 nits? Now, the teachers and the parents among us will be going, no, 0 nits is the correct number of nits. But if you've ever investigated a new television set and you're looking for all the specifications to see which one is the best, which one you would like to get, you'll know that a nit is a unit of brightness. It is an indication of how bright the picture is going to be in your set. So you might choose the one that is more bright than the others. But brightness isn't the only criteria. TV makers often tell you how much contrast they can display. And you get all sorts of funny numbers, 1,000 to 1, 1,000,000 to 1 even, of the contrast of the screen. It's between the darkest of blacks and the brightest whites. And that's the figure the enthusiasts are looking for. That's the really important one, is the contrast. To show the televisions off, they often have a picture on the screen that may be slow moving, and it will be some darkness with a bright light in the middle, so you can really see the dark darks and the bright whites and see the contrast that this television can display to you. Because contrast is important in our lives. Our eyes are drawn to contrast. That's why a zebra is more interesting than a donkey. Our eyes are drawn to extreme contrasts. Our ears are drawn to contrast too. If a songwriter wants to really emphasize the chorus of a song, he'll maybe die down the music a bit in the verse so it gets quieter and quieter, even to the point of a whisper. And then slam, the chorus comes in, loud and bright, and the contrast really gets your attention. All our other senses seek contrast as well. One of the best meals I've ever had was once, it was just a little beachfront cafe, but we'd been out for a walk, and the walk had been much, much longer than we expected. So we were really hungry. And we went into this cafe and ordered just an ordinary thing. It was so delicious to eat because of the contrast of the hunger that we'd had and been satisfied with a simple meal. Contrast is really important in our lives. And the writer of Lamentations knows this. He knows this rule, and he knows that it's really effective in poetry. The first 2 chapters that we have read in the previous 2 weeks have been really dark, haven't they? We've been in the depths of despair as the writer thought about what's happened to Jerusalem, about how the enemies have come in, they have destroyed, they have flattened, they have killed, they have taken people away. It's been very dark. We've had to really search for even the smallest glimmer of light in these passages. Even in the chapter we've just heard read through in chapter 3, it's still darkness. There is darkness at the start and there's darkness at the end, and there's this huge contrast in the middle as the light bursts out. And that makes it even more effective. It blazes out of the pages at us. Maybe when we sing the song later on, we're going to turn to Great Is Thy Faithfulness as our final song. And sometimes we miss out the context of it. Sometimes we sing Great Is Thy Faithfulness, and we imagine that the writer of that song was having a great life. Everything was fantastic, and he could say to God, it's great, you're faithful to me, you give me all the good things, all the mercies. But that wasn't the case. The writer had poor health. He had financial problems. He had to give up his job as minister of a church because of his health. He was in despair. But he found comfort in the words of Lamentations 3 when these words shone out at him. Great is your faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see. What was it that caused the writer to have this great turnaround. To go from the absolute darkness of despair to the joys of the Lord. What was it that made him turn that corner? Where does the light come from? Where does our hope come from when we are in darkness? And does it just fade away afterwards? Or does it stay with him? Does it stay with us? We're going to delve into this chapter to have a look at these things and to try and find some answers. Now, I know it said there was 66 verses there, and a few of you went, oh, it's a big chapter. Don't take too long preaching, David. But it's actually the same length as the previous ones. It's just that where there were 22 verses before, each verse is now subdivided into 3 lines. We heard before about how these are alphabet poems. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 4 have 22 verses, and each verse starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it starts with Aleph as the first one, and I don't know the ones after that, but there's 22 letters, and each verse starts with those letters. This one, chapter 3, does the same thing, but each letter has 3 lines, and each line starts with the same letter. So we've got A, B, 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 C, C, C. So that's why you see it as 66 verses here. The poem starts out in darkness, and then it turns to a brilliant light. It's like a match being struck in the dark. Suddenly there's light. One of the questions is, does it then go out and return to darkness, or does something remain with us? We'll see that as we turn to it. In the first poem, in Lamentations, we read about the suffering of Jerusalem. We read it as a picture of a woman who has suffered great loss. It talked about the Lady Jerusalem, if you like. And the writer of the poem thought about how terrible it was for this woman to suffer this loss and to have no one to comfort her. In the second chapter, we heard more about the people in the city. Instead of she that we heard all through the first chapter, in the second chapter it's they. It talks about how they have suffered because of the wrath of God. We read about kings and princes, we read about prophets, elders, young women, mothers and daughters, the young and the old. Individual people are suffering because of the wrath of God. And then we turn to chapter 3, and the very first word we read is I. I. In the third poem, the focus is on the writer. It starts with the word I, and we read about the deeply personal suffering of the author. It reminds me of some of the poems we learned about way back in high school. It was a long time ago for me, but back then when you studied English, there was always a section people did on the war poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, and it's burned in my mind the Dulce et decorum est line. They saw suffering. They experienced suffering during war, and they wanted to explain that to people who weren't there, and so they wrote poetry that is full of suffering and darkness. There was no light in their words. And that's how our passage starts. It starts in absolute darkness. Look at the first few verses of chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. The writer knows darkness. He has seen suffering and he has experienced suffering. And he wants to pour out his heart. He wants to explain to us what it's like. And it's hard to have the words to say. It's hard to explain in explicit detail. So he uses lots of metaphors and similes. He says it's like this, to explain how he feels in this dark time. Look at verse 4. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He says it's like a soldier who has been defeated, who's lying in the battleground, broken. In verse 7 he says, he has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. He feels like a prisoner. He is trapped. There's nowhere for him to go. Verse 9, he has blocked my ways with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. He feels like a traveler who is trying to get to his destination, and the Lord has put blocks in his way so that he can't walk straight. Verse 10, he is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He feels like prey. He feels that the Lord is out to consume him. Verse 12, he bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. He feels like an enemy to God. God is going to strike him down. Verse 16, he has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. He is destitute. There is nothing for him to eat except the bread that is made with the grit in it that breaks his teeth. He has nowhere to lay down except in ashes. Verse 18, so I say my endurance has perished. So is my hope from the Lord. He feels like an athlete who has run out of energy, who has given up. There is nothing to hope for. Despite all these different illustrations, all these pictures, the feelings are very real. He's in the depths of despair. He sees no hope for his situation. There's nothing he can do to change things here. There's nothing he can do to make anything better. There's no mention of other people in this passage up to this point. Nothing about Jerusalem. This is him. This is personal. He feels that the Lord is against him, and he feels pushed down. He is in utter darkness. I wonder if you've ever felt like that. I wonder if you've ever felt in a place where everything is terrible, everything is dark, and you see no hope. There's no way to prevent disaster from happening. It could even be that it's already happened. It's too late to try and change things. You're in the worst possible place. It's hard, but it's real for many in this world. Or maybe you know someone. Maybe you know someone who's in darkness, who's in despair, who's struggling, and you want to help them, you want to lighten their load, you want to make things better, but there's nothing you can do. What do you do? How do you show concern? How do you show love? How do you show help in these kind of situations? What does the writer of this poem, this chapter, do to turn things around, to turn his thoughts around from darkness into light? How can he get there? Well, look at verses 19 to 21. I think this is a real key, a real pivot to the chapter. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. What a change. And what caused that change? Firstly, he doesn't hide the pain and the suffering. He doesn't try and pretend that it's not there. He doesn't try and pretend that things are better than they really are. He remembers them, and he instructs us to remember his affliction and his wanderings, the wormwood and the gall, the bitterness that he's experiencing. He asks us to remember these things. Secondly, he shows us how this remembering has affected him. His soul within him is bowed down. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. He knows he's looking at himself and his circumstances, and he knows he's limiting his view. If our situation is hard and we're in a difficult situation and we spend our time looking down, which is only natural, then we don't see God. And with a great effort of will, it seems, he turns his gaze from himself and his surroundings, and he looks up at the Creator God. Here is where the torch is lit in the blackness of night, and the light blazes out. Here is where the song's mournful verse has died to a whisper, and then the chorus blasts out. Here is where the gnawing hunger is replaced by the taste of the most delicious food. So what did he call to mind? He says, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." What could he call to mind? He had nothing around him that gave him any hope at all. The situation was dire. There was no help for him there. What gave him hope in the darkness? Well, let's read on to find out. For the next 21 verses, we're treated to the most beautiful picture of the nature of God. Starting with 3 of the most powerful verses in the Bible about God. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. That's where he has hope. Not in his surroundings, not in his situation, not in himself, but in God. And he has hope in God because he knows the nature of God. He knows who God is. Perhaps one of the reasons the writer has turned from the darkness into the light and thought of this hope in God is because he has thought about what God is doing. He knows that God is disciplining his people. And he knows the scripture, so he knows that God had promised this would happen. Back in Deuteronomy, God has said, if you follow my ways, then I will bless you. But if you turn away from me, then I will curse you. I will cause you all manner of problems. And so perhaps as he thinks about these promises of God, that difficulties will come if they turn away from him, he knows that God fulfills his promises. And if God fulfills those promises, then God will fulfill his other promises, that if you obey me, that if you follow me, that if you're obedient to me, then I will bless you. So as he thinks on the nature of God and how he is faithful and how he keeps his promises, his heart is lifted. The light enters his life. When Job lost all that he had, he said that the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Now it's not that the Lord gives in love and takes away in anger. He takes away in love as well. Its aim is to turn his people back to him. Its aim is that they repent. They see the reason for their destitution. They know it's because of their sin. And so they repent of their sin and turn back to him. So in love, God withdraws the good things that they had so that they might turn back to him. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. What are the mercies that are new every morning? Aren't they just life itself? To awaken and to know the start of another day is by God's mercy. It's a gift from him. Again with Job, Satan was given every power over Job's life. He was given power to remove his family, to remove his wealth, to remove his servants, his household, even to remove his health. But the one thing God says you're not going to touch is his life. God held that. And we know that God holds our life. And so his mercies are new every morning as we awake and we breathe and we have a day ahead of us. It's a gift from the Lord. And he holds that faithfully every day. He gives to us again and again and again. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't get bored. He doesn't forget one day to give us daily life. He loves us without ceasing. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Who else could be our portion? Who else could be the writer's portion? Because everything else had been taken away. There was nothing else to lean on. There was only God. Sometimes we get comfortable. Life seems easy, and our portion might be our health, or our wealth, or our family, or our reputation. We might lean on these things. We might think that the skills that we have in life will help us through. Our position in life is good. They might be our portion, but everything had been taken away from this man. So he hoped in the Lord. The Lord was his portion. That was all he had. And so he took that and held on to it. For the next 18 verses, the writer contemplates the nature of God. We hear that he is a rewarding God, verses 25 to 27. To those who wait for him, he gives them reward. Who bear the yoke of suffering, he gives back to him. He is a faithful God, verses 28 to 30. Even as we are laid low, there may be hope, he says, because God doesn't forget his promises. He is a compassionate God, verses 31 to 33. It's not in his nature to cause grief or to afflict us, and he will have compassion. He is a just God, verses 34 to 36, who hates injustice and oppression. You know, when you read through the prophetic works in the Old Testament, you find that God time and time again chastises peoples and nations and rulers. And the thing that he seems to really hate is oppression. He hates it when people are pushed down. He hates it when the strong take advantage of the weak. Because God is a just God. He hates injustice. Verses 35 to 37, he is a creator God. He spoke and it came to pass. Again, looking back to Job, good and bad comes from him. He gives and he takes away. And now there's a call to action. After all this thought on what God is like, on the nature of God, the writer says in verse 40, let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. Why has God not forgiven? Because they haven't repented. They are still in their sin. They are still far away from him. They are still walking away from his light. And the writer calls them to examine their ways and to return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. They need to turn away from the way they've been going and turn to the Lord. From here it looks like the poem is returning to darkness, but there's still a hint of light. Something remains from this great light that he's shown us. Is it going to be an after image, or is it going to be an ember? Now, an after image is when most of you have experienced it, when you see something really bright, maybe a shape or something like that, and then you close your eyes and you can still see it. You can still see the shape burned in your retina. There's an after image of that picture there, but it fades away, doesn't it? If you keep your eyes closed, it gradually fades away to darkness. An ember is the remnant of a fire. It's a tiny glow that is nothing like the flame that was there before. But if you fan it, if you give it oxygen, it can burst into flame again. So what's going to happen in our poem? For verse 42, it looks like the writer's telling the people what to say. Before it was I have suffered, I am in this situation. But now the words are we. He says, we have transgressed and rebelled. You have made us scum and garbage. The situation around them is still terrible, but he's encouraging the people to turn to God. He's saying, here's what you need to do. You need to say that we have sinned. We have turned against you, Lord. And you need to turn back to him. In verse 50, he says, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. When the Lord sees their repentance, his promise is that he will bless them. He will restore them. The language turns personal once again after that. And we've talked before about the author of these poems. They say it might be Jeremiah. And perhaps it is, because in verse 52, he says, I have been hunted like a bird by those who were my enemies without cause. They flung me alive into the pit and cast stones on me. Water closed over my head. I said, I am lost. And we know from elsewhere that happened to Jeremiah. He was thrown in the pit. He had given a different message to the king. All the other prophets had said, don't worry, everything's going to be great. And Jeremiah said, things are going to be bad. And he was thrown in this pit. But that was his means of turning back to God and seeing God at work in his life. Verse 55, I called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. You came near when I called on you. You said, do not fear. Was it an afterimage that dimmed away? Or was it an ember that was fanned into flame again? It seems that he's returning to the light. You have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. He sees what God is, and he has hope again. Not just hope in God, who is his eternal salvation, but even hope in the situation. Everything is still darkness round about. Nothing has changed. It's still destruction in Jerusalem. Their enemies have still taken away all the people. But he hopes that one day things will change. He trusts in the Lord. Look at how it finishes. Verse 64. You will repay them, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. You will give them dullness of heart. Your curse will be on them. You will pursue them in anger and destroy them from under your heavens, O Lord. Suddenly he has confidence that things can change. Things will be different even in the world around him, because God is in control. How can you stand in the midst of disaster and have confidence that things will turn round? How can you have hope in the darkness? I'm sure it's a question many people ask in their lives. Even this week, we've seen that many people over in America have suffered a hurricane, and many have lost all their possessions. Their houses have been flooded. Some of them, they were flooded just a couple of years back, and they can't get insurance anymore. So it's just all lost. They have nothing. How can they have hope? Thankfully, God is an answer to the darkness. John calls it the true light. Let me read from John chapter 1, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then verse 9 to 13, the true light, John calls Jesus the true light. The true light which gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. The light was Jesus. He came into the world to bring light to the darkness. If you believe on him, you become a child of God, and the true light will always be with you. That doesn't mean everything will be great in your life. God doesn't promise that. In fact, he promises the exact opposite. He says that persecution will be yours if you follow him. But he is there in the darkness. Terrible things can happen all around you. And Jeremiah doesn't ask you to ignore those terrible things. In fact, he says, remember them. Remember the darkness. Remember the suffering. Remember the troubles. They're real. But then look to the Lord. Lift your eyes and look in Him. Let Him shine on you and lift your heart. Because He is a faithful God. Great is His faithfulness, and His mercies are new every morning. Let me encourage you with those words this morning when you leave. Think about them through the day. If you do not know Jesus as your Saviour, then you are in darkness, whether you know it or not. But God has sent a light that you might know light in your life. If you're a Christian and you're suffering, you're struggling, then look to the Lord. Ask Him to show you His light, to show you His nature, to show you His love. We're going to finish with the song, Great is Thy Faithfulness. But as the musicians get up to get ready for it, don't stand up yet, because I think when we sing this, we should really have an initial verse to give us the context. We should really start with the darkness before we then turn to the light. I'll not ask Kevin to make up some words to start us off, but let me read some of the words that we had in our chapter. The darkness first, and then the great light. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of His wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me He turns His hand again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. Now, let's stand and let's sing of His greatness.